morning's newspapers. We're joined by Benedict Spence and Shona Craven. We're going to start with this. I think it's in the Times, isn't it? It's about the flu, the spread of flu, but interesting reporting here about the number of people getting flu jabs.
Yes, only half of NHS staff are actually getting flu jabs, despite being warned that this is, and I say being warned, this is a particularly bad flu season. There's no sort of disputing it, and I'm speaking from personal experience here. Only half of them are, and the Times says that this is a combination of vaccine fatigue and anti-vax sentiment, which I think... Stop a second and take a step back. NHS workers, anti-vax sentiment. Now, there's a statement that I didn't think I'd ever actually be saying, especially in the sort of the post-COVID world. But here we are. And, I mean, it's one of those where, you know, OK, everybody, personal choice and all that, but nonetheless, you would have thought that given that this is potentially going to be affecting you, your work environment, you're going to be coming face-to-face with people who are more likely to have the flu, just for personal preservation, you might think to yourself, look, if I know that it's going to be a particularly bad flu season, I might want to take this a little bit seriously. However, clearly, this is a significant number of people not doing this. I'm just going to say it from personal experience. It's nasty. If you think that there's a chance that you might get it, get a jab, you know, protect yourself, all that sort of thing. It put me out of action for the best part of 2 weeks. Plenty of other people saying similar things. There's, you know, it's not a conspiracy. This is a particularly bad season for flu.
Yeah, there is plenty of flu vaccine. The UK Health Security Agency is saying that. But what we're seeing is that there's a sentiment, particularly I'm finding, anecdotally, at the school gates, parents are saying, I don't want to give my kid this vaccine. There's a sentiment around it that is particularly worrying. And the government are saying, look, we're going to do these mop-up clinics where we come to schools and there's stories about kids being super spreaders. So there's this whole cocktail of maybe misinformation, anti-vax sentiment too that's actually quite turning to something quite worrying.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to play devil's advocate, we saw with the COVID vaccines that ultimately the advice became for the younger population not to have that because of the risks associated. Now, that was a novel vaccine, it's a different sort of thing, but I wonder if that's part of the hangover, because this story does say low uptake among children and NHS staff is fueling the worst outbreak on record, and there's a lot about the proportion of children who are vaccinated. But, you know, it's about community protection versus individual protection. A lot of parents are used to their children picking up all sorts of bugs and bringing them home and probably are a bit resigned to that. And so the argument then has to be, well, your child will bounce back from this, but if they're going to see their granny at Christmas, you've got to think about your whole family.
That's it. Now's the time, if you want it, to get it, because it will take 2 weeks to filter in through the system. I was reading the other day, actually, the 5th of January is going to be the biggest strain on the NHS. And everyone comes back from the break, phoning up GP surgeries. So it's going to be a really, I think, a bit of a bumpy ride.
It's always a tricky winter, isn't it, for the health service? I think this one, again, is going to be another really, really challenging one. Let's move on to this on the front of the Telegraph, and you've picked this out. It's an interview with the head of the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, this is really interesting, certainly news to me. So what the story is, the head of the Met Police saying that retailers need to do more to help catch shoplifters. And I think we probably all are aware that shoplifting is on the rise. You can connect that to the cost of living crisis, or you could connect it to possibly other factors, organised gangs and things like this. But there's one thing to say, oh, the shops aren't doing enough in terms of passing on information, but it's another to say that there's evidence of corrupt security staff acting in league with shoplifting gangs to help them steal from stores. Now, I always wonder how much the security can do. You know, can they grab people? Can they chase people? You know, is it worth it to the shop for that to happen? But another thing that's mentioned is shops not necessarily giving staff the time on shift to speak to the police. But this notion of a sort of laissez-faire attitude, or it's not worth it, or we'd rather have the staff behind the tills than giving evidence. But then it's a very different thing to suggest that the very people who are supposed to be protecting the shops might be tipping off, well, now's a quiet time, come and do a raid.
Well, we see many stores do have security at the front door, and I mean, I haven't seen anyone nipping off with stuff from in-store, but I'd be very surprised if a security guard chased anyone down the street.
Well, if they chase someone, then they're leaving the shop undefended, and if it's an organised thing, then someone else could just...
And, you know, people are often told, you know, actually where there's the possibility of confrontation, do not, in fact, get involved, and that does apply to, you know, security staff. They're not police officers, they don't have the same power, and they are liable to be prosecuted if something happens. But I often wonder wonder if it is, and this is interesting talking about, potentially people being in league with criminals, because obviously there's a financial incentive there. I'm not going to sort of name names of stores, but I think that there's a real difference between different stores, some of which have security guards that do act, and they tend to be the sorts of shops that sell slightly more high-end goods, and the ones that don't, that tend to be more sort of lower-end goods. There's far more of a financial incentive for some shops, and therefore for some security guards, to actually get involved and intervene, and others, it really does just seem to be on your way. There's nothing to see here.
The most shocking thing that you see is when it's formula that's in a tag in an enclosed box and people trying to steal nappies, which talks of Shona's point about the cost of living crisis. We've done stories on Sky News about the black market and formula. Years and years it's happening, and so I just think it's a sad state of affairs. Benedict, take us over to The Sun, another sad state of affairs potentially, that this dip that we saw yesterday in the economy could put us on course, the UK, on course for recession.
Well, of course, this is all tied in, of course, isn't it? The cost of living crisis and the actual performance of the UK economy. And I think we have to recognise the state of the current economy is not the fault directly of Rachel Reeves or the Labour government. This is something that has been ongoing for some time. But certainly, I think the build-up to the budget, which of course was pushed back by a month from where it would normally be, and the drip-feeding of information of policies that may be coming in, may not, I think really did affect confidence from investors, amongst others, on the prospects of the UK economy. It appears now to have shrunk by 0.1% of GDP for October. The previous 3 months, it had also shrunk. I think it's quite clear, actually, that we are... There'll be people that say we aren't technically in a recession. I think it's quite clear that we are in a recession, whatever the technicalities may be of the terms. And this is something that I'm afraid is going to dog this government, even if they aren't the ones that got us into the mess. Actually, they promised a different approach to government. They promised growth. They promised a more grown-up approach to politics. Drip-feeding information to the media is not a more grown-up approach to politics, especially if it has a knock-on effect like this. And this is ultimately what they will be judged on. They inherited an economy which was not in a great shape after Ukraine and after COVID. Have things actually noticeably got better? No. We are having, obviously, the internal fights between backbench MPs and the government about things like spending on benefits, on welfare and all that sort of thing, and juxtapose that with tax rates, whether or not that harms growth, whether or not it hinders the ability of the state to function if you cut these things. It's a very tricky situation for the government to handle. And, I'm no supporter of Rachel Reeves. I'm very firmly planted in my politics. But I do think that she is in a really tricky situation where, on the one hand, the country is crying out for economic growth. On the other hand, her own party simply will not allow her to make the difficult choices that she and Keir Starmer said that they would be prepared to make when they came in, to actually try to get the economy growing again. For the time being, we remain in this stagnant position.
I mean, her party, or perhaps the country more broadly, because, one of the big choices they could make is trying to do a better deal with the European Union, which perhaps would increase growth. And some within the party have actually been saying in recent times, but they're still not inclined to do that sort of thing. And on the recession, it's 3 quarters of negative growth. So what are we now? 1, we're going to count again after Christmas. We'll see. On the budget, I don't think I've ever experienced a budget that was so talked about. So much talk. And a lot of it, as we realised, was just kind of blather to see what was going to stick.
And a lot of the headlines, a few of the headlines today, they're very much focusing on Rachel Reeves, very much personalising a picture of her going, ooh, saying she's plunged Britain into recession watch. But she's not acted independently. Obviously, she's working along with Keir Starmer, and she didn't go rogue and leak these things by herself. That was a strategy, but it's obviously been a bad strategy.
Odd one.
Yeah. What about the strategy of business rates? So the Eye is talking about pub landlords and how they're going to war with Keir Starmer and Labour.
Yeah, I had to check this wasn't actually the Express or the Telegraph. Why have we gone to war with pubs? And this is based on a quote from a senior Labour MP who should surely know better, saying, first we went to war with pensioners, then with farmers, and now with pubs. And this is worse because there's every chance Labour MPs will find themselves barred from their local. Well, God forbid MPs get denied a drink. I have to say, in all seriousness, it is a bit insensitive when there is a war in Europe to talk about a war on pubs. And it's quite complicated, really, when you get down into it, because what Rachel Reeves has done is change business rates in a way that she claims will lead to permanently lower levies for hospitality premises. But MPs these backbench Labour MPs and campaign groups are warning the opposite effect will be achieved. So I don't have a personal stance on which is
we did speak to a
correct,
Republican just in the days after the budget who said exactly this, that they were going to be really struggling. Hospitality was going to really struggle because of the decisions made.
I mean, it's one of those sort of ongoing stories of this country, the rate at which pubs are being, hampered, the rate at which they are closing down. And it's a tricky thing because it's not just hospitality. Hospitality is a very good bellwether, I think, of the economy in general. So obviously, if you have lots of hospitality venues closing, that's not a good sign. If nothing else, you need people to have something to look forward to. And, we can argue about the benefits of pubs or whether or not that is the best way to do it till the cows come home, fine. But there is a cultural link also with the idea of the local pub, all across the UK. And it's when people see those buildings closing down, those places where they used to socialise, where their parents perhaps went and socialised, when they see those closing, it's not simply about it's a lack of avenue to go and socialise, it's a sense of heritage as well that's disappearing.
It'll be a national travesty if pubs disappear from the high street. That's my stake in the sand.
All right, Benedict, Shona, thanks so much for that, as always. Well, look, plenty more to come in the next hour of the programme. Do stay with us. We'll be back after this very short break.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist?